Today on the Perception in Action podcast, the third and final episode in my series looking at the use of virtual environments for studying and training sports skills. How have researchers used virtual environments to distort reality, disobey gravity, create conflicting feedback, and alter an athlete's perception in the name of science? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at some creative ways in which virtual environments have been used by researchers to further our understanding of perceptual motor control and motor learning in sports. In particular, I want to focus on studies that have used conditions that would be impossible, or at least very difficult, to investigate in real sport. For this, I have divided studies into 6 broad categories. Active psychophysics, using projectiles that break the laws of physics, removing or changing the reliability of perceptual information sources, manipulating feedback, coupling object movements to the movements of a performer, and studying difficult to reproduce or rare events in sports. So let's test the bounds of reality in the name of research. Approach number 1, active psychophysics. This is a term that I coined several years ago when I started using virtual environments in my own research. Psychophysics is a brand of psychology concerned with understanding the relationship between physical stimuli and the psychological sensations they produce. It was started in Leipzig, Germany in 1860 by Gustav Fechner. The field is primarily concerned with determining perceptual thresholds. In particular, the detection threshold, which is the smallest intensity of a stimulus a person can reliably detect, and the discrimination threshold, which is the smallest difference between two stimuli that is required for a person to reliably tell they're different. The real strength of psychophysics comes from the methodologies developed for presenting stimuli to an observer to effectively determine these threshold values. For example, the method of limits involves gradually increasing the intensity of a stimulus, say the volume of a sound, until the observer reports they are aware of it. This would eventually evolve into the staircase procedure, which is used everywhere now, including in hearing tests, many academic tests like the GRE, and it's also part of many of the perceptual and cognitive training systems for sports on the market. Over the years, psychophysical experiments have had immense value both in research and application. A good example of the former can be seen in color vision theory. The idea that color is processed by 3 channels in our visual system was first clearly demonstrated in a set of psychophysical experiments by Hermann von Helmholtz in the 1800s. It wasn't until 1956 that physiological evidence corroborated this by showing we have 3 cone types in our retina. A good example of the practical value of psychophysics can be seen in the now ubiquitous MP3 file format used for music, and the podcast you're listening to right now. It was through a series of careful psychophysical experiments that researchers determined that audio could be compressed with minimal changes in perception. So, using psychophysical methods is an extremely effective way to understand our sensitivity to different sources of perceptual information. However, and this is where I'll bring it back to virtual environments, traditional psychophysical methods have a couple of very important limitations when it comes to understanding the perception involved in performing complex actions like those involved in sports. The main issue is that the methods use very passive responses. The observer will typically press a button to indicate yes, no, I see it, or that it was the left or right stimulus on the screen that was brighter. So in other words, the natural perception-action cycle is broken. Because of this break, traditional psychophysics can only tell us if a particular perceptual information source could be used by testing whether or not we are sensitive to it. It can say nothing about whether or not it actually is used or how. And in reality, psychophysics experiments haven't really even been all that effective in identifying which information sources could be used, because we're pretty much sensitive to everything. For more discussion on this issue, please check out episode 25B, where I discuss the perception of acceleration. For me, virtual environments solve this issue by allowing a researcher to do active psychophysics. That is, still have precise control over the stimulus presented and use many of the wonderful techniques, like staircase procedures, developed by the psychophysicists, but at the same time keep the perception action cycle intact by allowing the participant to respond in a more natural way instead of pressing a button. Now we can answer the other questions. If we change a particular perceptual information source and it has no effect on movement, then, even though the athlete may be sensitive to it, we can conclude that it is not used for controlling the action. If we vary a different information source and it causes an athlete to change their timing of their movement, then it is used, and we know specifically what for. Let me give you a couple research examples of active psychophysics. The first comes from my research. In my very first study I published on research using my batting simulation in 2002, one of the first questions I was interested in was understanding how batters use time to contact information to time their swing. This arose out of my PhD dissertation, in which I used traditional psychophysical experiments to measure sensitivity to different optical variables that specify time to contact. For example, the rate of expansion of the ball's image. In 1978, Fitch and Turvey proposed a really simple and elegant solution for how to use this information to time actions like a baseball swing. Swing so that the movement time is the same for every pitch, say 200 milliseconds, and then just initiate this action when the time to contact of the approaching ball reaches the same value, 200 milliseconds, maybe plus a little bit to take into account perceptual motor delay. By doing this, you would very easily ensure that the bat and ball arrive at the plate at the same time. Do batters actually do this? Well, for real batting, it's hard to assess because, especially back in the early 2000s, it was difficult to precisely manipulate and measure time to contact information for a real ball. And it was hard to measure when the swing started and its movement time in the field. But all of this was easy to do in my batting simulation. What did I find? The results were completely inconsistent with the Fitch and Turvey idea, as swing movement times varied substantially based on pitch velocity and location, and batters did not initiate their swing at a constant value of time to contact for all pitches. So how they used perceptual information was much more complex, and would be something I would go on to tease apart in several more active psychophysics experiments on baseball batting. Another good example of this approach can be seen in the rugby research published by Correa and colleagues in 2012. It's long been believed that the perceptual information used by a ball carrier in rugby to make decisions about whether or not to keep the ball and run or to pass it are based on the relative spacing of players on the opposing team. Traditional passive psychophysics experiments would tell us that we are incredibly sensitive to such gap information, as the discrimination threshold for determining which gap is bigger in this situation would be a matter of inches. But how is the gap information used? What are the critical values which afford running versus passing? Does the use of gap information differ for experts and novices? How does the critical gap relate to the size of the player and their running speed? The perception of gaps must be attuned to action capabilities, something which cannot be assessed in a passive experiment. But all of these questions are really tricky to study in real play, because it would involve precisely controlling the movements of real, and typically very large human beings to alter the gap information. Enter virtual reality. In their study, Correa and colleagues created a virtual 3-on-3 rugby union task presented via an HMD. Participants faced virtual opponents and were required to choose between running with the ball, making a short pass, or making a long pass. These actions were actually really executed with a real ball and tracked with a motion tracker. They weren't just passive decisions. What was found? As expected, the size and locations of the gaps had a systematic effect on the player's actions. For example, when gap 1, which is closest to the ball carrier, was the one that was opening up or increasing in size, they most often decided to keep the ball and run. There was also a systematic effect of skill level. Namely, as playing ability increased from recreational to professional, the attunement between the gap that was opening and the action taken was higher. So again, I think this is a great example of combining realistic actions with precise control over perceptual information using a virtual environment.
So you better realize by the look in my eyes that I've had about enough of your life. I've had about enough of your life.
Approach number 2, projectiles that break the laws of physics. Of course, one of the most fun things you can do in a virtual environment is to play God and see how the athlete responds to your newly imposed laws of nature. But, as I mentioned in the first episode of the series, this also has real research value because it allows for dissociations of predictions that can't be done in real environments, thus creating new opportunities for strong hypothesis testing. A really good example of this approach can be seen in research on the so-called outfielder problem. That is, what perceptual information do fielders use to run to catch a fly ball, and how do they use it? For a great review of this topic, with a specific emphasis on how virtual environments have advanced theory, I would again recommend the great review article by Frank Zoll and Reinoud Boetsma, published in 2011. But for a specific example, let's look at the study by Fink and colleagues published in 2009. Broadly speaking, there are two classes of theories about how a player runs to catch a fly ball. Predictive theories, which assume that a player has an internal model that can be used to predict the future location the ball will land and just run there, and prospective theories, which propose that no internal models or predictions are used, but instead the fielders couple their running to some perceptual information, such that if they maintain this coupling, they will arrive at the ball. Within the prospective category, there are two theories that have been debated about for years: the optical acceleration cancellation theory and the linear optical trajectory theory. The information sources used for these two are suggested by their names, but for more detail, please check out episode 5. A basic problem when trying to determine which of these three theories, predictive, acceleration, or linear trajectory, is correct is that for typical fly balls in the real baseball game, they all predict successful catches and similar running paths. To address this problem, Fink and colleagues had participants move to intercept fly balls in the Venn Lab virtual environment at Brown University, which consists of an HMD, motion tracking, and most importantly, a 12 by 12 meter room. The clever manipulation used in this study was to alter the second half of the ball's flight. All balls were launched so that they reached the zenith at 25 meters above the ground, and then would hit the ground at one of 4 different locations. In half of the conditions, the flight path was a perfect parabolic arc, before and after it reached its zenith, which of course is what happens with a real ball. But for the other half of the conditions, the experimenters broke the laws of physics. For these balls, the first half of the trajectory was still an arc to the zenith, and they still landed at one of the same 4 locations. However, after the ball reached the zenith, it traveled in a straight line instead of an arc to its landing point. Let's think about how this dissociates the 3 different theories. For predictive control, the outfielder predicts the future landing location based on the early part of the ball's flight, then just runs there, without using any more perceptual information. So, they should move the same no matter what happens in the second half of the ball's trajectory. For the 2 prospective control theories, the second half of the flight should matter, because movement is always linked to perceptual information, which would change depending on whether the ball traveled in an arc or along a linear path. But the specific paths to the ball should be slightly different in the linear condition if they're using optical acceleration or linear trajectory. Have a look at the paper for specific details on this. What was found? Participants were clearly not using a predictive control strategy and seemed to follow paths consistent with the optical acceleration cancellation strategy. Sounds convincing, but since it was published, a few issues have been identified. In particular, participants actually caught less than 50% of the balls in the study, so it's hard to argue if they were using an effective strategy. There have since been more follow-up studies in virtual environments. Again, see the Zoll and Boetsma review for more. Also, a very similar manipulation to the Fink and colleagues study was used in a virtual soccer ball heading task by McLeod and colleagues with similar findings. Link in the show notes. Another interesting example of breaking the laws of projectile physics in a virtual environment can be seen in the study by Gabriel Diaz and colleagues published in 2013. In this study, the authors used a virtual racquetball environment to study how athletes might use an internal model of ball dynamics to predict its trajectory and to control their eye movements. As I discussed way back in episode 3, in sports which involve hitting a ball after it bounces, like cricket, squash, and racquetball, there is some evidence that performers use visual information to predict where the ball will bounce and its trajectory after the bounce. They then jump their eye to the predicted location quickly with a saccadic eye movement, which is followed by smooth tracking to the point of contact. What information is being used to make these predictions that control the eye movements? Is it solely based on the visual information from the ball? Again, this is difficult to study in a real-world paradigm because it's hard to systematically manipulate the ball flight parameters. To address this issue, Diaz and colleagues had participants hit virtual racquetballs of different speeds and recorded eye movements. The key manipulation was that halfway through the experiment, the researchers changed the coefficient of restitution, or elasticity, of the simulated ball without telling the participants, from 0.58 to 0.73, or vice versa. Like in many of the studies I've been talking about in this episode, this created an important dissociation. For two balls with different elasticities, traveling at the same speed and angle, their pre-bounce trajectory will be identical, but they will follow a very different trajectory after they bounce. Therefore, if participants control their eye movements solely on the basis of visual information during the ball's flight, this should produce similar pre-bounce eye movements to the predicted bounce location. However, if an internal model of the ball's dynamics, specifically its elasticity, is used, this should result in different pre-bounce saccades for the two different conditions. What was found? After the ball was changed, spontaneously and without any instructions, participants made pre-bounce saccades that were dependent both on the ball's velocity and its elasticity, which allowed them to track it effectively after the bounce. Approach number 3, changing the reliability of or removing perceptual information sources. When an athlete performs a skill like returning a tennis serve or hitting a baseball, there can be multiple sources of information that can be used to perform the action. As a researcher, this can make it difficult to determine which sources are used, and if more than one is being used, how they're combined. So, to understand the skill completely, we really need to be able to make particular information sources weaker or remove them altogether. I've already discussed a couple of methods that have been used to do this in sports. First, we have temporal and spatial occlusion methods, which remove part of an opponent's body from view or part of the ball flight. A second option is to somehow constrain the range of stimuli presented to the observer so as to change which variables are specifying and non-specifying for the task. Examples of this can be found in episode 54. But there are limits to what can be achieved with these two approaches. With a virtual environment, we really get complete control over perceptual information. As a simple example, I will again mention my first batting simulator study I ran in 2002. For many years, I heard people claim that hitting a baseball is a completely perceptual task. Since there are good sources of perceptual information the batter could use to judge the time to contact and direction of travel, they just need to wait until the ball is released, predict where and when, and then swing. Simple as that. There is no need to try and read the pitcher's delivery or anticipate the pitch by using the count. But this explanation never seemed to jibe with me, as I could think of numerous examples where batters swung at balls that bounced before they reached the plate, or did not swing at all at pitches right down the middle. To test this, I created the world's most difficult pitcher in the simulation. Specifically, the simulated pitcher could throw pitches that ranged in speed from 75 to 95 miles per hour randomly, could hit all edges of the strike zone, but they had exactly the same delivery for every pitch. There were no laces on the ball to detect spin, and the parameters of the pitch were equiprobable with every pitch count. So in other words, all the batters in my experiments could use was the visual information from the flight of the ball. What did I find? Consistent with my hunch, the experienced college players used in my study simply could not hit in this condition. Another good example of restricting perceptual information using a virtual reality can be seen in the handball study by Vinay and colleagues in 2010. The goal of this study was to investigate goalkeeping behavior in handball. In particular, the authors sought to determine the relative importance of advanced cues from the shooter's body kinematics versus the perceptual information from the ball during its flight. Again, two things that are difficult to isolate in reality. The virtual shooter was animated using motion capture data from a real shooter performing different shots. Participants were 10 elite handball goalkeepers competing at a national level, and their motions were tracked while attempting to save the virtual ball. 3 conditions were compared: a ball-only condition, a thrower-only condition, and a ball plus thrower condition. What was found? Not surprisingly, performance was best when both the thrower and the ball were visible, with a 31% save rate. Performance dropped off slightly to 29% when only the ball was visible, a change that was not statistically significant. Finally, there was a significant decrease in performance to a 14% save rate when only the thrower was visible. So in sum, this study provided very different results to those found in typical visual occlusion studies, in that body-based advanced cues alone were insufficient for making a save, and they did not seem to add much to the perceptual information provided by the ball during its flight. Approach number 4, object movement coupled to action. An interesting manipulation that I don't think has been used much in research with virtual environments to date is to have the movements of objects in the environment change in response to a particular aspect of the user's movement. Here I'm not talking about just having the viewpoint in the simulation change as the user moves their head, but instead doing something fancy like having a ball's trajectory change in response to specific kinematic markers in the user's movements. I think this could be an effective method to use because it would allow a researcher to assess exactly when different sources of perceptual information are being used. As an example, I'll tell you about some unpublished data I collected as part of a study on check swings in baseball batting I published in 2009. For those that don't know, in baseball, not uncommonly a batter will start their swing early in the ball's flight, then try to stop it once they get more information and realize the pitch will not be a strike. If they can successfully stop their bat from crossing the front of the plate, the umpire will call the pitch a ball. In the 2009 study I mentioned, I developed a model of this based on when different information sources become available. But I also tried a really fun condition. When batters swing, there are a distinct set of kinematic stages they go through. The pre-swing starts when they lift their lead foot off the ground and ends when they put it back down, for example. Well, in my simulation, these kinematic markers were directly linked to the flight of the ball. So, for example, in one condition, the pitch was a perfect strike until the batter picked their lead foot up, at which point the trajectory changed so that it would be a pitch in the dirt. Or, the ball might suddenly start heading way outside as soon as the downwards movement of the bat began. Using this manipulation, which of course is impossible with a real ball, I was able to determine which type of trajectory changes, for example speed changes, up-down movements, left-right movements, a hitter could respond to, how they responded, and at which points in the swing they were able to do it. I will tell you more about the specifics of the results in a future episode. I'm not sure whether this has been done yet, but I think this type of manipulation would be really interesting to try in many of the other sports simulations that are out there. For example, in soccer, rugby, football, or hockey. I think we could learn a lot about skills in these sports by having the movements of a ball carrier or shooter in the simulation linked to the movements of the user. Approach number 5, manipulating feedback. As I've discussed several times on the podcast now, the perceptual feedback an athlete receives right after executing an action, so in other words, about their action outcome, is incredibly important for successful performance. Several studies have shown that this is the optimal thing to focus one's attention on while performing a skill, and it is what is used to correct errors and recalibrate an action. So, given its importance, why not mess with it in the lab? Back in episode 18, I talked about one study in which I did this by making the visual information from the flight of the ball leaving the bat, the sound of bat-ball contact, and the vibration feedback through the bat handle conflict with each other. So in other words, the visual information might tell you hit the ball hard, while the thud you heard at contact indicated it was a poor hit. Through doing this, I was able to understand the weight batters place on different sources of feedback. Pitting information sources in conflict with each other is a very commonly used technique in basic research on perception, and it has yielded a lot of valuable insights. So I think it should be done more in studies of perception and action. Another time that I did this was in a 2007 study I conducted in collaboration with Tom Carr in Sion Beilock. In this case, we completely removed all feedback. So after each swing, the simulation stopped and the batter received no feedback at all about where they hit the ball. Instead, they were asked to move a simulated cone to the location on the field they thought the ball would have gone. If they felt they swung and missed, they were just told to put the cone on home plate. We compared expert college baseball players and novices in their ability to do this. Not surprisingly, experts' markings were closer to the real outcome of their swing. Furthermore, the accuracy of the markings within the expert group was related to how well they performed over the previous 10 at-bats. If they were on a hot streak, they marked more accurately on that trial, while if it was preceded by a slump, they marked less accurately. We argued that this occurred because their attention was more focused on anticipated action outcomes when performing well. Approach number 6. Studying difficult to reproduce or rare events in sports. Again, I think this is potentially another great advantage that virtual environments give us. As one example, we can look at the work done by Kathy Craig and colleagues on curved free kicks in soccer. Simply executing a curved free kick in soccer is hard enough, never mind repeating it over and over again in precise enough manner to study it effectively in the field. By recreating it with a virtual environment, Kathy and colleagues were able to precisely control the direction and magnitude of trajectory offset and see how goalkeepers of different skill levels respond. If you're interested in the outcomes of this research, please listen to my interview with Kathy back in episode 22D. Another relatively rare event that highly skilled athletes seem to be able to handle is a sudden change in trajectory. For example, a bad bounce in baseball or a deflection in ice hockey. What can we learn about this ability by using a virtual environment? In a study published in 2010, Larunago and colleagues used a virtual interception task in which the participant's hand movement controlled the movement of an effector on a screen and was used to hit a moving ball. The key manipulation was that on half of the trials, chosen randomly, the target suddenly changed its trajectory 400 milliseconds before contact. Changes could be either to the left or to the right and had two different magnitudes, 12 or 27 centimeters. 11 expert tennis players were compared to 10 non-experts. What was found? For the non-deviated trajectories, performance was very similar for experts and non-experts. But experts were much better at minimizing movement errors when the trajectory changed suddenly. Analysis of movement kinematics revealed that this expertise difference was primarily due to the fact that experts had a smaller perceptual motor delay. That is, the time between when the trajectory changed and the first functional adaptation of their hand movement occurred. Interestingly, within the expert group, there was a significant correlation between the performance in this altered trajectory task and their national tennis ranking in France. So, to sum up, these are just some of the examples of ways in which VR has been used in clever ways to study sports skills and further our knowledge of perceptual motor control. By distorting reality in virtual environments, we can create lots of new opportunities for strong tests of theories. I think there are a ton more studies we can do of this type. I also believe there are a lot of great paradigms for basic research that could be easily ported into a study of sports skills using a simulator. For example, the dual task paradigms I've used in my research. I know it can be hard to convince people that have spent hours and hours making a virtual environment highly realistic, that you want to do something impossible that could never occur in real life, so if they give you any trouble, send them my way. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Coming soon on the Perception and Action podcast, another topic motivated by a book chapter I'm working on. revisiting attentional theories of choking under pressure. Do we still believe that failing under pressure is caused by thinking about what you're doing too much? Or is there more to the story? Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter at ShakyWeights. And to find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
If tears were liquor